Okay, let's talk about Davos. Davos was a really, really difficult undertaking, and I'm really happy that it turned out really well, and I'm really happy that people enjoyed it. The reason it was so difficult, I've talked about this before, but first of all, the story deals with Davos going to Skagos, and we kind of know that from the final Davos chapter in A Dance with Dragons, that they're heading to Skagos. The problem is that George has written Skagos contradictory. Um, he talks about ships stopping at Skagos throughout the story, but at the same time, he talks about Skagos being this sort of um, isle where no one knows what's going on there, and things like that. So you've got this fundamentally you have this contradiction. Like, how do you have this secret isle that only the werewoods know what's going on there, but at the same time you have Night's Watch ships like making port at Skagos, and the Magnar being mentioned as going to the wall, or Skagosi being on the wall and talking about the Magnar and things like that. So we had to come up with a Skagos that roughly fit that contradiction. And so we established different houses that were secretive and different houses that are open and things like that. Um, and then the other big problem with Davos is the fact that Davos disappears at about the 1/3 point of A Dance with Dragons, and so it has to be most of the story has to be done in flashback. And if one thinks that Robert Glover is the hooded man, you have to have Robert Glover disappear at a certain time. So you had this, and then the third big thing is that this is a smuggler's mission. And what the hell? Why do we need a smuggler for Skagos? This is well established in the last chapter, and so I'd never seen, when people speculated about Skagos and what Davos was doing on Skagos, I'd never seen a fan address all of these things. How do you deal with the contradiction of Skagos being secretive and yet open at the same time? How do you deal with the time uh, disruption where this story is taking place near the beginning of A Dance with Dragons, timeline wise, and how do you deal with the and fitting that all in, and then well, what was the last one? It doesn't matter. But and then how do you deal with it? No, it being a smuggler story. How does one deal with that? The other big thing is, if you also know, I'm very critical of the Davos story in A Dance with Dragons. I think it is George's worst POV in that book, because Davos's story isn't his. It doesn't involve anything that relates to Davos previously. Davos's story is mostly about Stannis and Melisandre, and you could argue that there should be things about the Blackwater and his relationship with the mother and his feelings about his dead sons and things like that. And the Dance with Dragons story for Davos does none of that. He is just a spectator observing events that are going to happen in the Theon story, and perhaps observing events that might go on to play a part in the Sansa story. But it's not Davos's story. He just sits there. He just sits there as the smuggler that watches. And so making a story about Davos that involves all of these things, the that where he is playing a role. That's the thing, is in A Dance with Dragons, he has no agency. He just sits there and watches as stuff happens to him, as he's brought from place to place and listens to people talk. So I wanted a story where Davos does something. His choices are important. That where it involves what's happened to him so far in the past, with regards to Stannis and Mel and the Blackwater and his sons, and his relationship with the mother, and with his relationship with his wife. And then it has to be a smuggler story, and deal with the contradictions and all of these things. But so many things had to go into the story, and then trying to make it also just not be immensely long. The other things that people had, so many people were like, "Oh, the Davos story needs to be like five chapters to deal with Skagos." We just don't have the time for that. So having something that does all of these things, but also be somewhat concise. It turns out it's a really long chapter, but we did what we could. Oh, and then also the fact that on the random comment that George made that he wants to have sex and unicorns together. So fitting that all together, here we are with Davos. Um, so Davos, the gods were watching, and he was ashamed in their sight. The idea is that we know that the werewoods have to play a very important part in this story because that's what people say. Only the werewoods really know what's going on Skagos. But at the same time, Skagos is going to be a weird island. It's different. They historically don't get along with the rest of the North. So their take on the old gods has to be different. We had to have a world building aspect that was different than this. And this gets into, so he's just, Davos is ashamed because he is having sex. He is having sex next to unicorns. And it's this creepy thing because this Davos almost feels like an innocent character despite him being a smuggler. He seems so good compared to everybody else. I mean, he's maybe not Brienne, but he's so good compared to the other characters. And so him being shoved into this horrible situation is, to add to the creepiness of everything. So may the mother forgive me, Davos Seaworth thought as he lowered his trousers. Marya too. So trying to bring in both his relationship with the mother. This is a man where the mother, he believes that the mother spoke to him and rescued him from the Blackwater. And so he should have a full religious enlightenment in his head. That's never really been addressed in the story, so we wanted to get into that. Lowered his trousers. We worked on this because like his pants dropping to the floor and things like that. He didn't want it to sound too vulgar or cliche, so it's like he lowered his trousers. He's definitely, he's about to have sex. The right roots had grown down into the room, burrowing in and out of the ceiling's black earth. In the flickering light, they seemed to move, twisting and squirming like giant maggots in a slab of rotten meat. Laughing maggots. There were tiny faces etched into the roots, hundreds of them giggling grotesquely overhead, gawking with weeping eyes, mocking, leering. Davos could not put them out of mind, so he settled for out of sight, fixing his eyes on the girl's breasts instead. So yes, this is this idea that they have a different take on the old gods. They're etching faces in the roots of the werewoods as well. Established in like the world of Ice and Fire is that a lot of the houses and people on Skagos live beneath the earth. So if they're dealing with the old gods and they're living beneath the earth, the idea is that these roots would be watching and being like worms. And it starts getting into this idea of bringing back stories like In the House of the Worms, George R. R. Martin's story. And so this idea that all the old gods are watching him at all times. And then we transition, obviously, to the girl's breasts. And now we're talking about the breasts. He fumbled with her bodice. The knots had been done tight, and the shortened fingers on his left hand were all but useless. Bring it in, Davos' shortened fingers. After a hard tug, a lace finally broke, and her breasts spilled out into the open air. He wasn't the least aroused. That was he's not getting hard here, even though he's got breasts in the open air. The girl was no beauty, though Davos had lain with uglier women in his meaner days. Davos has mentioned that before that he has had affairs. He is a smuggler who is away from his wife for sometimes years at a time. And so among men that are readily going to sex workers, to think that Davos is somehow purer than them is kind of ridiculous. He's going to sex workers as well, as he said in the story that he has. So we try to get some ugly sex workers here. He recalled an Ibidese girl with hair on her chest, a crow from Gulltown old enough to be his grandmother. Originally, I had that be the Summer Isles, but I think one of the editors pointed out too many. If they're all foreigners, this idea that foreigners are just associated with exotic sex, and so this was switched to Goldtown so that it's just not constantly foreigner sex. And a wide-eyed whore at the Happy Port in Bravos. Obviously, this is yeah the appears in the Mercy story. I think her name is Eardra. What is it? Um, Irene. It's oh man, I'm so. I think it's what is her name? Yeah, Ina One Eyed. Ina One Eyed. And so she apparently apparently Davos has had sex with Ina. They've been what a smuggler could afford. Why did I rise for them and not this one? So he's having trouble getting it up, and for some reason, and the idea is that the mother is getting to him. Davos knew the answer. He'd betted all of those before the mother had spoken to him. Now he was turning a deaf ear to her voice. The bonds of marriage were sacred to the seven gods, the mother most of all. Yet here he was setting them aside for these to serve these damn trees. It's the gates of Dragonstone again. He was letting the gods burn. This comes back in the end, the idea of letting the gods burn. The gates of Dragonstone is, of course, referring back to Davos 1, a clash of kings where they take the gods, the wooden gods from the sept and bring them out in front of the gates of Dragonstone, and they burn them. And so this is, of course, going to come back, burning gods. But this is kind of this idea that things are different now. Things are different now with Davos. A deity, he believes a deity spoke to him. And I just feel like Davos needs to act like, oh my gosh, I've been spoken to by a deity. And he does mention this all through, A Storm of Swords. And then it's just his relationship with the mother just vanishes in A Dance with Dragons. So we wanted it to come back. This transitions. The room smelled as it had that night of smoke. The odor came from the furnace, which piped warm air throughout the castle and whose chimney wasn't far from the room's high window. This idea that, that there's these furnaces pumping warm air throughout Kingshouse, that they're actually kind of technologically advanced in some sense. Its hearth was fed with unicorn dung, he'd been surprised to learn, and a dozen of those shaggy beasts could now be heard snorting and nickering as they grazed above. And here it is, the sex next to unicorns. This is the J.K. Rowling rule that she says can never happen, is that you don't want sex next to unicorns. And George R. R. Martin said, no, I totally want sex next to unicorns. So here we're having it. In many ways, the furnace is introduced just so we can talk about the unicorn dung, just so we can talk about the unicorns. Moonlight shone through the high window and silvered the maid's features. This is a very common thing that George puts in stuff. Moonlight silvering people's faces. Davos searched them for something fair, something to excite them. Her cheeks were well pimpled, as too were her shoulders and breasts. She had a pug nose, thick eyebrows, crooked teeth that protruded well beyond her lips. Those lips were thin and cracked, and the upper one was hairy, like Queen Salice's. Queerly, it was that made his members stir. And so we're just getting kind of weird and creepy. This is all just to be weird and creepy, but the idea that the fact that she looks a little bit like Salice is turning Davos on is really screwed up, right? And we're not sure if it's because he's playing the role of Stannis that turns him on, or the fact that it looks like Salice turns him on in a weird way because Salice has a certain power over him, or is it in an elevated position or whatever. But the idea is that just we wanted the scene to be creepy. We're creating this atmosphere of creepiness. These roots that look like maggots all through the walls that look like rotten flesh, with these faces laughing at him, bleeding eyes, and now he's with this ugly girl that looks like Salice and who's naked, and this whole weirdness is the idea. It's just to creep everybody out. Was this was this how Stannis felt when he came to her bed? It was no secret that there was little affection between the king and queen, and even less in the way of lust. Yet both of them had done their duty. Princess Shireen was proof of that. We just get a shout out to Princess Shireen. That's the idea here. And the main thing was to bring up duty. And this was Davos's duty. The Magnar had insisted to become. So we're introduced to the Magnar. He was called the Magnar in A Storm of Swords, in a similar sense as like the Wool or the Nori, the Magnar. It is their surname. It's House Magnar, but it is referred to as the Magnar by Donald Noy, I believe. To become the tree requires sacrifices. They've left me incapable. You must act in my stead. And so we get this foreshadowing of the Magnar. We kind of know that the Magnar is, later we find out that he has this belief that he's becoming the tree, which is, kind of like Bloodraven. Like he somehow thinks that he needs to become the tree. And so we're hinting at the Lord's right to the first night here. He's the Lord, and so there's no other Lord around except for Davos. There was no other Lord at Kingshouse, to be sure. The boy was too young by far. Actually, Rickon is a Lord, right? He's the new Lord of Winterfell. And Rebecca Glover held no lands. And in fact, he'd be a master. This is rarely talked about in Ice and Fire. It's an appendices thing, but in the South, if you're not a lord, you're a landed knight. But in the North, there's no knights, so they're just called masters. And so they're master. You can be a master of a land, which is the step below a lord. And so Robert Glover, he's not the lord. Galbert Glover is, but Galbert, he's the heir, and Galbert, they kind of think maybe Galbert's dead, but nonetheless, Robert Glover doesn't hold any lands right now. And even if he did, he's a master. A lord must fulfill the right. And this is the thing, is the spelling here. The right, as in a ceremony, not a right as in something that a human being can do. Lord. King Stannis had given them that title the day he'd left his dungeon cell. And this is a significant part. He becomes the Lord of the Rainwood. He was a landed knight up until A Storm of Swords, and then he becomes the Hand, and he becomes the Lord Hand, and he becomes the Lord of the Rainwood. And so he says, then rise again, Davos Seaworth, and rise as Lord of the Lord of the Rainwood. This is a line from A Storm of Swords. This is also a dick joke. In case you missed it, the idea is that Davos is becoming erect at the same time. He's rising as Lord of Rainwood. And so then we get into the Lord's right of the first night. It was in the Age of Heroes that men first practiced the Lord's right to the first night. Although it had been abolished by the good Queen Alysanne 2 centuries past, her decree hadn't stamped out the tradition completely. We kind of know this. You may get into some hair splitting about if it's her decree or whether it's Jaehaerys' decree, but everybody talks about the good Queen Alysanne being the one that abolished it, even though, and this is Davos's perspective, so him being exact on whose decree it is, it's not that important. But then we get into where it hasn't been stamped out. Now, Davos doesn't know very much about the North, but he knows about the Narrow Sea. So he sees the silver-haired dragon seeds were a common enough sight on Driftmark and Dragonstone. And so that's this idea. It's also seeding the idea that maybe Dany might be a dragon seed. But yes, if Davos knew about the Lord's right to the first night, he would know about it in a Narrow Sea sense, not in a northern sense. And Arain Waters would boast they all shared the blood of gods. Arain Waters being a bastard of Driftmark because he was a Stannis guy and he's a sailor. It stands to reason that Davos and Arain Waters would know each other. And know each other actually probably pretty well, even though it's never never brought up. There are even whispers that when a young bride had violet eyes, the red crab still claimed his right. And this is just kind of reestablished that the Celtigars are out there, and they're presumably a Valyrian house as well. And that the red crab, might be taking part in the Lord's right to the first night if he felt it was necessary. I mean, if the girl had violet eyes, then he's trying to produce, whatever, the special genes, that kind of thing. But it was no right on Skagos. No, to the Stoneborn, it was a right. I got a couple comments like, "Oh, do you mean duty here?" It's like, no. I think they were listening just to the audio, and it's obviously it doesn't come in the audio. It was no right on Skagos. To the Stoneborn, it was a right. It was a ceremony. Yeah, if the girl saw this evening as a blessing from the gods, her face hid it well. Does this poor maid despise me? He wondered as she lay back on the mattress. As the sex begins, he climbed onto the bed and lay upon her. Her eyes looked beyond him to the roots above. She prefers their faces to mine. She's looking at the weird roots instead of him. As he entered her, she let out a low grunt. Was she ashamed of this as well? To her, he was a monster. Was he a monster defiling her marriage? Her husband must want to strangle me. A little foreshadowing of later we're going to meet Groff. And then Davos would have felt the same if it were his bride to be. And this is mainly to transition here, because we transition to talking about Marya, a woman that I've always felt does not get enough attention in Davos's story. So we decided to give the genesis of their love story here. So it was a summer long past when Davos first met her in the Smuggler's Cove. And that's the thing, is how does a smuggler meet a carpenter's daughter? That's what we know about her, is that she's a carpenter's daughter. So we need to have smuggling involved. Well, how would smuggling be involved with a carpenter? Well, he needs to be bringing wood. He needs to be bringing forbidden wood. Well, what wood would be forbidden? And then we come up with the story here. So his skiff was piled high with black-barked lumber purchased from the Tourmaline Brotherhood. We're talking about the black-barked trees from Karth, the ones that produce the Warlock's wine. Nightwood, we just kind of invented this. They called it a wood as beautiful as ebony, but far easier to carve and doubly prized by carpenters. Just kind of adding something like, oh, well, we're going to be, he's smuggling in this wood for the carpenters, and that's how he's going to meet this woman. The laws of Westeros had forbidden the tree from entering its ports, but along with its leaves, its pods, and its wine, an act of the first king Aerys, who's only half as mad as the second. In case you are really paying attention to your lore here, the King Aerys was kind of a puppet. Bloodraven was really the one that ruled the kingdom. So when we say that the laws of Westeros, that Bloodraven is the one that didn't want the Warlock's wine, leaves, or wood, or anything in Westeros, that this is Bloodraven's actions. He doesn't want other competing magic in there, or warlocks doing weird things. He wants control. And which is why we have the Tourmaline Brotherhood from Karth. So this is the whole story here. It's quite, there's actually quite a bit of information here that about what's going on here. But Davos was smuggling the same wood that produces the Warlock's wine from this Karth Tourmaline Brotherhood, and the reason he had to smuggle it is because of Bloodraven. And we get this reason for him to meet her. So she had mousy brown hair and haggled as fiercely as a Dornish fishmonger. Haggling as a Dornish fishmonger has been mentioned before. But she did it with a smile, and her eyes were kind. Davos was a new captain and had nowhere to be in haste, so he offered to carry the wood to her father's workroom and accepted an invitation to stay for supper. That's how he meets her. He was smuggling wood, and he goes back. He fancies her, so he helps carry some wood. He meets her father, and it's a very innocent story. But the question is how do men and women meet in this world? And there's usually family involved, things like that. You've got it's not like the world. It's not like the Western world today, where men and women independently go out and date, meet each other online or in bars or at work or in a book club. Like there's meeting people organically is very difficult. In olden times, usually marriages are by family, but Davos is a smuggler. He doesn't have a good family, so he does meet her organically. But how do you meet women? If you're a smuggler, how do you meet a nice girl like this? His bride was beautiful that day. The sun set alive in her hair. And then we wanted to make this creepy. You've got this like wonderful little cute story about him meeting his wife, her haggling, and him fairly innocent story of him going back and having dinner with them, and then him getting along with her and staying, and a fortnight later them getting married. And then it's transitioning to him being back and he's climaxing. And his vision, he conjured, turned to nightmare. Marya went pale, her eyes changed from brown to red. The idea is that she's changing to look like Melisandre before his eyes. He's coming while thinking of Melisandre to make this even creepier. It begins with Selyse. He thinks of his wife, and then it ends with Melisandre. The witch's laugh rang in his ears. Give me the boy. And this is going to come back. Give me the boy is, of course, like something that he dreamed that she sort of said about Edric Storm, but in a sense, she's already taken like 4 of his boys, And here, and the entire story here is about them wanting a boy, the Magnar wanting a boy. So in a sense, like it's again the story of Davos giving over boys, giving over his sons, giving. And I like to interpret the Edric Storm story as him thinking about his sons. It's not there, but I it's one of those like headcanon things that the reason he wants to protect Edric Storm is that he's thinking about his sons. But the idea is that all of this is in together. Give me the boy. We get this Edric Storm reference, but it's about this chapter, and then it's going to be about his own sons. So. With a shudder, Davos opened his eyes and pulled himself from the girl. His seed leaked out into the bed, but to him it was spreading, sickly green, wildfire. So he's given boys. He's given his sons. He's given 4 boys, and wildfire took them. It moved. At once it crawled up his leg, his torso, his neck, his face. It was smothering him, pouring into his nostrils and mouth. He was drowning. This is, of course, a reference to him at the Blackwater. He was drowning at the Blackwater. But this idea that he is now being drowned by wildfire or his own semen or a shadow baby. I mean, there's elements of the idea of the shadow baby here too, because essentially the semen is dripping out of her vagina in the same way that the shadow baby drips out of Melisandre, but it's wildfire. We're evoking all of these things of the Davos story at once. The shadow baby, the wildfire, Edric Storm, his sons, Melisandre. Davos wanted him drowning. Davos wanted to scream, but his own voice wouldn't come. Instead, he heard only the wails of his sons. And that's the thing, is I always felt he hasn't mourned his sons enough. So I wanted the sons to be a big part of this. Dale, Allard, Mathos, Merrick. Would have been, I mean, in the rule of 3, it would be better if it were 3 sons, but it's 4 sons in the story, so it's got to be 4. And then they were gone. The next thing you knew, he was wandering. It was a listless shuffle through the sunken corridors of Kingshouse. Now we're getting the setting here. We're at Kingshouse. The geography of Skagos has never been established in Ice and Fire. We kind of vaguely have a shape of the isle, but that's about it. And so we placed Kingshouse at the base of the bay. Skagos is roughly like a smashed heart. There's like a bay at the very top. So the idea is that Kingshouse would be at that bay. And so Kingshouse is the only true port. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting this way and that through the castle's many hollow hills. So we're getting this idea of the hollow hills underneath the weirwood, just like Brotherhood Without Banners or Bloodraven lives in these hollow hills. and the large subterranean atmosphere of Westeros in general. Um, Somebody mentioned in their submission of it being a Motte and Bailey, and it's like, oh, that's kind of clever. It's not. It's called a Motte and Bailey, but it's not a Motte and Bailey at all. Because a Motte and Bailey is essentially you've got this hill, and then you've got your fort on the top. And the idea is that during peacetime, you can kind of go out into the Bailey and to have all of your activities, you know. But when forces come, everybody can go up the hill into the Motte and be protected. Um, and so King's House, it's kind of the same situation, but the Motte, it's a hill up to Weirwoods. It's just so that your fort is trees. Everybody's actually coming in from the Bailey and going down, but it's the same function as a Motte and Bailey, and it would kind of look the same as a Motte and Bailey, except for the fact instead of a castle, it's a weirwood grove. And so this is the kind of idea is that this is different. It's similar, but it's different. That you've got a Bailey. It's mainly grazing lands here, and they do all their Bailey stuff. But then if there's battle, they go underground instead of up into the fort, because up into the fort is actually just weirwoods. Um, so this is why he says there's little above the earth save the trees and some grazing land for the livestock. So it's a weirwood grove and a grazing lands are their Motte and Bailey, but it functions the same way. Much and more was hidden below, hundreds of passages and chambers, and he'd been told there were still levels underneath, tunnels going deeper and colder, then warmer again. The idea is that Skagos is a volcanic island. There's actually far too few volcanoes in Westeros. It's actually kind of a geologist would kind of be like, where are your volcanoes? Dragonstone is kind of the only proven one. So the idea is that we're going to make Skagos also a volcanic, add a little more. So the idea is that they're going to be warm underneath the ground as it becomes the geothermal or volcanic energy there. He passed door after door, everyone oaken and time worn. Originally, this is Weirwood, but the editor was like, I understand that there's like spears and arrows that we see in the story made of weirwood, but it seems weird to like chop down a weirwood and make it into a door. Let's just avoid, like, that seems sacrilegious. Let's just avoid all of that. It's like, okay, it's oaken. All looking much alike. Only the faces on the roots differed, and none of them looked familiar anymore. So this big thing is that he's going to eventually begin to map out the layout of the castle based on the faces, which is relevant later. He supposed he'd ventured far from his room, but even of that he could not be certain. How long had he been walking? Without the sky overhead, he was losing all sense of time. As we are in the story, because months and days and whatever go by, and this is... Davos had freedom of the castle. It was a kindness easily granted. There was nowhere to escape to. Lord Greel Magnar ruled King's House, and King's House controlled the only true port on the island. Yes, so... if you want, you can... Let's see. Let me bring up like any sort of official map of Skagos, because you don't want if you actually look at let's try the Beyond the Wall map. Yeah, that's a good one. So here's Skagos. You can kind of see it's kind of roughly heart shaped with the big finger sticking out. But the idea is in the pit of the heart is your only true port on the island. So you're going to put King's House there. But that's the idea. Greel, the name Greel. A lot of people put different names. Greel is the protagonist of the story Dark, Dark Were the Tunnels. And so, went over various names that people had suggested for the Magnar. None were great. I don't know if Greel fits fantastically, but at least it's a reference to an old George R. Martin story. Dark, Dark Were the Tunnels is a story about a very pale human who telepathically speaks to rats, and he ventures through tunnels on a post-apocalyptic Earth like that. And the human civilization on the moon has come to see if any humans have survived left on Earth. Both societies are in a population bottleneck. They don't have enough genetic diversity. And so if they start interbreeding, humanity can be saved. But tragedy happens instead. But Greel is our main character. So we say, oh, that damned ice. He thought we'd be back with Stannis already without it. He reached for his bag of finger bones, but he lost it with the rest of his luck. Bringing the finger bones back, But we had to come up with a reason why he's stuck here. And the idea is that, storms and it got cold and because of ice. So the destination had been set back in Newcastle. This was a setting way back in Davos 4. The boy Wex had snatched up a driftwood cup and pounded on the table, and it was Lord Wyman who'd figured out the mutant's meaning. Rick and Stark had fled to a keep called Driftwood Hall on Skagos. It seemed Wex had heard the waddling woman speak of it while he was hiding up in Winterfell's heart tree. Had to come up with a reason on why they knew exactly where they were going. Like, somehow you've got this mute boy who has not been to Skagos, who knows exactly where Osha and Rickon are for some reason, and Wyman knows that it's that the smuggling needs to be done, so invented this entire story behind how Stain and Driftwood Hall, that, okay, the Stains are okay, Driftwood Hall is where they are, and then, we've got an entire reason on why a smuggler is needed for this. This is all getting into trying to fit together the puzzle pieces that George kind of laid out in the previous story. Driftwood Hall was the seat of House Stain. Sailors knew it as the only place on the island for trade. And we've heard about trade happening with Skagos, so you've got to, somehow deal with this contradiction. And the small folk were friendly enough at that. Okay, and a reason that Osha felt like she could go there. Okay, that there's a good house on Skagos. It's the one that people do trade with, one where Osha would feel safe. To reach them was no easy feat, however. A nearby river ran slow and deep. But a petty squabble over lands led to House Kroll claiming the harbor for themselves. And as for the Krolls, and this is just to deal with the contradiction, that Skagos is at once this friendly island that Osha would feel safe going to, but at the same time it's a very dangerous isle. So we invent these two different forces, Kroll and Stain, to deal with the contradictions that we've had in the story. If the Stains were the best of the Skags, the Krolls of Deep Down were the worst, or so it was said. With tales of raiders, cannibals, rapers of men alive or dead. Davos didn't know the truth of himself, but he remembered Rora Uharis's words when they'd sailed past the isle long ago. In A Dance with Dragons, we do learn a little more about Rora Uharis, and Davos does tell the story of the Cobble Cat going north of the wall. And so if we learn stuff about Skagos, it's going to be from Roro's mouth. So we wanted sort of an interesting story here. This all gets into why a smuggler would be needed. The woods by the river are thick, and woods are like beards they are. The blind bastard had stroked his own green whiskers as he spoke. He's Tyrashi. Most of us have them, but handsome men don't. Have you noticed that? That's because they're for hiding ugly things. Of course, it's funny because Davos has a beard. Blind bastard has a beard. They all have beards. Davos Seaworth had sailed on the morning tide from White Harbor, accompanied by Robet Glover, Wex Pike, and a dozen Manderley sailors. There's this idea of, should we bring Robet and Wex along? Yeah, why not? But the only ones that we know is that Manderley specifically says that he has Manderley sailors, but they're all rivermen, and he wants a professional. A fortnight later, the Isle of Skagos peaked above the horizon. Under black sails and dark of night, their cog had slipped between those dense woods and up and well up the infamous river. Yeah, just making out a fortnight, how long it would take to sail from White Harbor to Skagos. He scratched his beard nervously, but in the end, no attack ever came. They were 5 leagues from Driftwood Hall before the waters thinned, and from there they made the rest of the journey on foot. So we needed to come up with a reason why they would be stuck, Okay, Deep Down has the only port, but so, but there's other ways to get into the other houses because we trade with the other houses, but then that port could disappear. So we come up with the idea of the frozen river, which is a normal thing. People talk about cold ports and warm ports and ports freezing over and things like this. I mean, the reason why Dalian in China was considered such a prized possession, or Qingdao. The Russians have all these ports, but they end up frozen. So like Vladivostok can freeze over, and so they want warmer ports. And so the Russians always had an interest in Manchuria. It's the same today, where they have interest in the Black Sea, because the idea is that they want warm water ports. Finding the keep was easy enough, and within it, proof of Wix's tale. The boy lord and his wildling guardian were here and hale and healthy. Honored guest, hale and healthy is pretty common in Ice and Fire. Honored guests and the castle's master. The idea is that you can't have a lord here, because if there was another lord on the island, the Magnar wouldn't have any need for the lord's right to the first night. So House Stain they're not lords, they're masters, just like the Glovers. Honored guests of the castle's master they were, though the old man must have worried that harboring them would draw Roose Bolton's ire. When the spearwife agreed to return to the mainland, the master had toasted the hand and ordered an honor guard to return them to their ship. The mission had been one good fortune after the other, and so Davos had already been on edge. Too much luck. When the winds are fair for too long, expect a storm. This comes back in the end when he's carrying off the bride, Carolee. A lot of people had more background, or a lot of editors were saying maybe we should have more. I mean, we're not really explaining why Osha would trust Davos. We're not really explaining why the Stains would allow them to stay, or why they would allow them to go. And it's just like, we got to move on. Like, we're just assuming that all of this is worked out off page. Like, explaining this logically is about like why they were taken in with the lords, and I mean with House Stain, and why they were allowed to stay, and wouldn't they be fearful of the Manderleys? Don't they think the Manderleys work for the Boltons? How do they know that they're for Stannis? Why would they like Stannis? Like, all of that explanation would take pages and pages and pages, and it's just not needed. Like, it worked out off page, done. And that's not the main conflict. The whole thing is that Davos is already being like, isn't this a little too convenient? And it is. So it's all very convenient. But we just couldn't get into the details. Like, oh, what was Rickon doing? Like, what's his relationship with Shaggy Dog? Done. Just move on. Can't explain everything. I'm sorry. But sure enough, before they'd even left Driftwood Hall, the skies had darkened and the snow had begun to fall. Davos never thought he'd feel colder than he had to be swamped by the sea. He mentions his coldness that he'd swamped by the sea in A Dance with Dragons, but Skagos had taught him better. When they got back to the river, it was already frozen over, trapping their cog right there in the ice. And so there is our reason. They needed the smuggler because of this river. It's also the reason that they're stuck on the island and they have to deal with the Magnar. The damned ice, Davos thought for the thousandth time. It was the ice that had forced them to Kingshouse, the only true port in the Isle of Skagos. The only one that wouldn't be frozen till spring. And for the use of the port, he'd had to treat with the Magnar. A smuggler's life is only 1 part tricker for every 9 parts dicker, the blind bastard would say. It was true. Bribes and bargains were how most forbidden goods were trafficked, not on a smuggler's skiff. This is a bit of Um, this is a bit of me like correcting George. George, he talks about the smuggler's life and the black sails and everything, and it's like that's not how most smuggling happens. It's never been how most smuggling happens. Most smuggling happens through corruption and bribery. Okay, that's how most goods pass through. It's not people sneaking stuff in. I guess this is a problem in Star Wars too. Like, oh, we've got these like smugglers holds and things like that in case they're searched and all of these things. And it's like, no, most smuggling happens through corruption. Um, you find a guy at port who you bribe, and he lets you pass things through. Um, and so I just kind of wanted like a reference to that a smuggler's life is not really sneaking things in secret compartments and slipping through with under black sails. It's actually a life of bargaining. Um, and this is just a little bit more realism in the story, but it also comes in here because he's supposed to be making a deal, and smugglers should be the best bargainers. So this is the whole thing: 1 part tricker for every 9 parts dicker. To dicker is to bargain. It was bribes and bargains were how most forbidden goods were trafficked down on a smuggler's skiff, and it was a haggler's wit that guarded a sailor when he was caught dead to rights. One of the editors didn't like dead to rights. It's an idiom. Dead to rights is to be caught red-handed, but George loves throwing in random little idioms, like unknown idioms here and there that sound like they're of the time. And it just sounds a lot better than, when he was caught, or when he was caught red-handed, or when he was caught, dead to rights. Just kind of like it's just such a useful idiom in this situation. It sounds Georgy. It sounds George, right? I think in Britain they call it bang to rights. He was caught bang to rights, but in America it was dead to rights. It just means caught red-handed. In the end, Rora's tongue hadn't been nimble enough to save his life. When Davos saw his head roll across the deck of the Cobblecat, he'd resolved to be quicker than his old captain. And he had been. Over the years, he talked his way into his own ship. And this is the whole thing about Davos, this is kind of bringing it together, is that in truth, a smuggler is mainly a bargainer. That's not what George has written, but I kind of like the idea that if you actually look at the Davos story, especially A Storm of Swords, he spends so much time convincing Stannis. Okay. And so in a sense, like, he is a good smuggler in the sense that he's a good bargainer. He's good at convincing people. And it's less about sneaking in under black sails with, whatever. And so this is the whole idea, is that Davos is a good smuggler in that he is a good talker. Over the years, he talked his way into his own ship and into a family and out of a dozen prison cells, which is, Davos just keeps ending up in prison and keeps getting out. He had talked his way into a knighthood and into a lordship and out of the Red Woman's fires. All true. But no amount of talking had kept him from the right. The Magnar had listened to it all with solemn patience, only to tell him again what he had to do. The corridor snake. This is bringing it back to the Lord's right. The corridor snaked to the right, and now Davos could hear distant music. The celebration, he remembered. How had he forgotten? It was a wedding feast and a farewell feast in one. He should have been joyous. They would finally depart this cursed isle. Perhaps if he never spoke of it, the memory of this evening would vanish from his mind. A drink could help with that. He quickened his pace. The great hall was crowded with skags and heavy with the smell of unicorn. Just wanted a nice line there. Skag is, of course, the derogatory term for skagosi that people use in the story. And so it's like crowded with skags and heavy with the smell of unicorn. It was their foal's meat that had been prepared for the feast. A foal is a horse's young. And so what do you call a baby unicorn? I guess a foal as well. So, but the idea is that it was a foal's meat, lightly roasted and rare, served in a sauce of its mother's milk turned pink. In the Bible, kosher cuisine is classically not supposed to be um, uh, 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 any youngling cooked in its mother's milk. This is why they interpret it as that you're not supposed to have meat and cheese together for kosher. But this idea of being cooked in the mother's, it's directly being anti-kosher here. This is a biblical reference that it's served in its mother's milk. That is, supposed to be creepy. Um, Mother's milk turned pink. Just in, there's going to be mentioned the blood later, so you don't want to have too much mention of blood, but it's still blood. The white and the red go together to make pink. Around the platters of meat were other dishes known only to the island. Green lobster stuffed with cheese and seaweed. The green lobster is the sigil of House Magnar, so you'd think there'd be green lobsters around. And so that's just getting stuffed with things that we think would be around. There'd be unicorn cheese and seaweed. Huge mushrooms, black as polished jet and bathed in butter. And shark soaked in urine and fermented for 3 moons. This is actually an Icelandic dish that I've had. It's horrible. But I mean, if you go to Iceland, you should try it at least once. The idea is that sharks urinate through their skin, and so the urine is then used to ferment. The urine in its own skin is used to ferment the shark. So they bury the shark in the beach for a while. I don't know if it's 3 moons. It might only be like a month. And then the shark ferments, and then you can eat the fermented shark. It smells like, it tastes and smells like eating smelling salts. I don't know if you've ever had smelling salts or ammonia. If you've ever smelled ammonia, like it's that powerful, pungent, like filling the nose kind of feel. But yeah, it's not great. It's like you're eating smelling salts. It's there's no like flavor to the meat or anything like that. It's just like it smells like smelling salts, and you're eating it. It tastes like smelling salts. It's not a great dish. Even the Icelandic, like it's there. Maybe old men like it or something, but it's there for the tourists and for people to try it. But it's not like Icelandic people actually like. They're too busy eating hot dogs. There's nothing so bad as human flesh. But some of the dishes made Davos' stomach turn. This is the reference to cannibalism on the island, that it was a myth, that they're not really doing the cannibalism thing. I mean, there's the rumor about House Kroll, and he mentioned it's here, but pale grub, that if we're just kind of having gross food here, pale grub steamed and salted, huge brown spiders fried to a crisp, and a bitter mash made of acorns of weirwood, dark veins in it, red as blood. This is, of course, the weirwood paste that Bran eats with Blood Raven. And so Lord Greel, he's trying to become the tree, so the mash must have been Lord Greel's favorite. He's trying to become the tree, so he's eating the weirwood paste. Beyond a sea of unicorn pelts, the Magnar shoveled spoonful after spoonful into his mouth, barely taking the time to breathe. The Lord of Kingshouse was an obese man, even fatter than the Lord Manderley. He had to be incapable of sex, which is kind of a reference even to Illyrio claiming that he does all this sex, and it's like, Illyrio, you're completely incapable of having sex. You're far too fat. Even fatter than Lord Manderley, with pale and pockmarked flesh. This idea is that he's this big, fat, obese man, but he's like a weirwood is the idea. He's got this pale and pockmarked flesh, kind of like a tree. His head is completely bald, but Davos supposedly he'd once been redheaded because he's got clumps of crimson hair, just like leaves sprouting from his double chin. A few clumps of crimson hair sprouted from his double chin. His knees were too weak for him to walk on his own, so he went everywhere with his guards, clad in rust dark armor. The rust dark armor is actually a reference to in the House of the Worm. So they describes people with rust dark armor, and I was like, that's a nice term, rust dark. They acted as his legs, often carrying him on a palanquin of wood and bone. We used to be weirwood, cut out the weirwood. Don't want to deal with that. Besides the Magnar on the dais sat. Oh, beside the Magnar on the dais sat the Lord of Winterfell, Rickon Stark. Um, there's some discussion. A lot of people have these ideas of Rickon Stark actually not being Rickon Stark and things like that. This is because there's references to the wolf being proof of the boy, and it's like, what is that? What does the wolf prove? Like you could, but we just did not have time to get into Rickon Stark. Rickon Stark will appear later in the story. We don't need. We've got a lot of things to get done here, and so we just we didn't need Rickon, so we just have this discussion of just him sucking marrow from a unicorn bone, something a little savage, but just not enough time. Not enough time to get into it. Plus, he's a little kid. He's just saying kid stuff. The boy's direwolf was in the kennel. By his side was seated the spearwife Osha, glowering impatiently as she usually did, trying to get Osha in there as a character. We get a lot more Osha in the story. Further down, Robert Glover hadn't touched the meat set before him, and instead was studying a wax tablet that Wex had taken to writing on. I foolishly, for some reason, had for a long time Sir Robet and the Knight and things like that. And it's like, no, he's a Northerner. He's not a knight. Oh, right. Oh, yeah. So all that's been fixed. So this is getting into the hooded man and the kinslayer idea of the Theon chapter. The idea is that the term kinslayer doesn't appear until the hooded man arrives. The hooded man uses the term kinslayer. Then the spearwives start using kinslayer, and then Mor's Umber uses kinslayer. And it's a little silly because obviously, like, Theon is not a kinslayer. Like, he was a ward. Like, everybody knows that. Why are they calling him a kinslayer? And why does he have such a negative reaction to it? And so it's this gets into that, the kinslayer theory that Theon at least believes that it's possible that he killed his own children when he killed the miller's kids, because he was banging the miller's wife. And so the idea is that he was having these nightmares. Wex sleeps in his room, and so Wex knows about the kinslayer idea. Wex is the one that's passing it to Robert Glover. Robert Glover passes it to Mor's Umber and to the Spearwives when he enters Winterfell. So this is the idea. The mute boy had been seated with the Matterly men, but left his place to show off his latest scribblings. The place of honor at Lord Greel's right hand was empty. Place of honor at right hand is often talked about in Ice and Fire, and so you kind of need this mentioned. Yeah. It was reserved for the king's hand, Davos knew, once I performed the rite. Servants stepped aside to allow the Lord of Rainwood to take his place on the dais. My lord hand returned at last, thank the gods. The music was loud, but the Magnar's voice cut through it. We need to just establish that he'd heard the music before. It's a party. He wiped acorn mash from his lips, missing a bit by the red at the corner, just to make him creepy. He's got blood, like the sap from the werewood. Your cup is filled. Good. You were gone for some time. Did you fall asleep? Often George advances plot in dialogue. This is a little bit of that. Like sometimes like someone will be talking and then he'd be like, oh, I see blah, blah has arrived. And then you don't need to say blah, blah has arrived. Someone mentioned it. So your cup is filled. Good. You know, you're gone for some time. Did you fall asleep? You know, the idea is that Davos is nodding or something. Did you fall asleep? I must have. This is somewhat to explain his hallucination, his vision. So the nightmare still rankled him. Aye, but it's done, Davos said curtly. My part at least. I mean, the idea is that Davos is around werewood trees and everything. It could be anything messing with Davos's head. Like maybe it was a dream. Maybe the werewoods were messing with him. Maybe it was a glass candle, but, you know, leave it open. Their agreement was a great victory, as hard as it was to stomach. Lord Greel had pledged his fealty to Stannis and consented to deliver Lord Rickon Stark to the King's cause at White Harbor. Originally, I think in the outline I had him delivering him to Eastwatch. But I was pointed out by an editor that, yeah, just timeline wise, that just would not work out. It would not work out because you've got, like, if Rick and Stark showed up at Eastwatch, um, somebody would send a raven to Jon Snow, and so he can't show up at the wall. And like I was like, oh, but I really wanted him at the wall. And it's like, no, okay, well, we're guess you're right. I mean, he was right. Like you need Rickon to arrive someplace where we don't have eyes. In fact, it's already kind of weird. There's a lot of weirdness in the story in A Dance with Dragons of people knowing and not knowing Davos is dead. Like for some reason, Stannis knows that thinks that Davos is dead, but at no point does anyone at the wall think Davos is dead. Certainly not his son. Certainly not Devon or Melisandre. So like, how is news getting? Obviously, the news didn't make it to Stannis before he left. So I guess the Karstarks brought the news or something. You got to get these little things, but that means like Stannis clearly, by the time we do the Battle of Ice, he doesn't know about Lord Rickon Stark, but maybe some people, know, and there's a rumor going around. Obviously the hooded man comes into Winterfell, so communication is a big deal here. But the idea is that you're throwing him to a dark area without POV, so that there's a cloud of information, because not all the with that, Skagos was Stannis's. House Kroll agreed to release sailors they captured, survivors from 2 of Salladhor Sand's wrecked galleys. This is Olito and Old Mother's sons are some galleys that are specifically mentioned that they crash on Skagos, so we're bringing this back, and they play an important role later on because Davos needs help. And the Magnar declared all but one of his ships for the king's to command until the war's end. Further, the Houses of the Isle, the idea is that he can give all but one, because one is needed for the Lord's right to the first night and the delivery of the baby. Further, the Houses of the Isle pledged 1,000 men-at-arms, 100 archers, and 200 riders mounted atop the fiercest war unicorns. This is just this idea that later on we're going to have some really cool unicorns for battle, and here we're going to get them. 200. I mean, got some war unicorns here. This is going to be great later on. Got some battle with some unicorns. So, in return, the hand of the king promised neither the Iron Throne nor Winterfell would collect taxes from Skagos for the next 15 years. This is very similar to the tax exemption given to the Arbor after the Blackwater. Davos doubted whether they planned to pay him the 16th, but what was that to him? Other tokens of alliance had been necessary in the meantime. Robert Glover agreed that his daughter would wed one of Lord Greel's sons once she's flowered. She's pretty young. She's nowhere close to flowering, but yeah, and not to mention she's also a prisoner on the Iron Isles. So it's quite a, Robert Glover is actually like giving not that great of a promise here. Like, oh, my daughter in like over 10 years who's currently captured. Yeah, sure, why not? Anything can happen. The king's hand likewise promised his son Stefan to be the Magnar's daughter when he came of age, though in this case, Lord of Kingshouse chose the bride. This is Davos again giving sons, giving up stuff. Stefan is he's what, like, I'm guessing he's like 10 or something. I don't know if we were ever given an exact age. But Stefan is, of course, named after Stannis' dad. It says here he's 7. Okay, maybe it was given an appendix or something. So Stefan is named after Stannis' dad. He's got a son. He's got a son named Stannis and a son named Stefan. Notice no son named Robert or Renly, because Stannis had a problem with him. Then in this case, Lord of Kingshouse would choose the bride. But there were more peculiar requests. Lord Greel demanded a great tapestry be woven in his honor, at least 20 feet wide, to be displayed in Stannis' throne room for all the court to see. This is just kind of funny because with Baratheons and their tapestries and stuff like that. It's just the idea that Stannis would have this great Skagosi tapestry in his throne room is just such a ridiculous thing that Stannis would hate, But at the same time, it's like, oh, I guess I got to do it. Further, every 3 moons, a shipment of Dornish blood oranges was to be delivered directly to Kingshouse, paid entirely by Lord Manderley and not King Stannis. Though the Magnar did not explain this provision. This is just to be funny and weird. Like, man, getting these oranges all the way up. Just, Plus, we love our mentions, our references to Dorne. Finally, and of paramount importance, there was the Lord's right. Every year, the king would send a lord to Skagos to take part in the ritual, and Davos would be the first. Because the Magnar is the only lord. Right, I think we made, before it was back when we talked about House Kroll, it used to be Lord Kroll, and we had to make it to House Kroll, because Krolls are also just, it's a master, he's not a lord. Stannis could hardly have hoped for better terms. Shouldn't his hand be proud of the bargain he'd struck? After all, what did he truly sacrifice? Pride, faith, a wedding vow he'd broken 100 times? Compared to what he'd given at the Blackwater was a pander's sum. I kind of invented this term, pander's sum. Thought it was appropriate. Like, what's a small amount in Westeros? Oh, pander's sum. But it's true. This is this idea that what is he really giving up? He's already cheated on his wife a million times, half 100 times. And it's true that, like, compared to the Blackwater, what is he giving up? And that's the question: is at the Blackwater he gave up sons, and so the idea is that he's still giving up sons because he doesn't realize at this point what it is. This is important. This is important. The idea that the real, like, why Davos does what he does is that he's given up sons in the past, and he doesn't want to. He wants to stop giving up the boys. He wants to stop. This is the whole thing of, like, Edric Storm and why he fought for Edric Storm, and the idea is that he's trying to save his children. He's trying to save the children. After a loud belch, the Magnar signals his guards, and they rushed to his side. It took 3 of them, all grunting with effort, but eventually they got their lord to his feet. Though it obviously pained him, he stood true on his own, and the effort drew the attention of the whole hall. The room hushed. Then one of Lord Magnard's sons passed his father a cup, and he raised his arm in a toast. My children of stone. That's what they call themselves, stoneborn. Skagosi called themselves stoneborn, according to the World of Ice and Fire. The cold winds rise. This is, of course, we hear this a blot, and soon winter will be upon us. For the nonce, enjoy the sun and feast in its dying rays, for soon all color will flee save what blooms in the rot. This is heavily inspired by In the House of the Worm. In the House of the Worm is a story about a planet that is around a dying sun, and they just kind of live a hedonistic, fatalist kind of existence. And they're like, yeah, we're all dying, but there's plenty of feasting to have. And I think they specifically use the term about things blooming in the rot, like the idea of these colorful mushrooms blooming in the rot. Anyway, this is I really loved the beauty of that of George's reference to blooming in the rot. So it's in there from In the House of the Worm. I implore you, bring in your herds and call in your kin. We all descend beneath the ground, into the stone, into the trees together. So this is, of course, like getting into the Children of the Forest and Bloodraven, and how when they die, they go into the trees, into the roots. And here he's talking the same thing. Because, vaguely they've heard these stories and these ideas before, but it's been twisted over time. For it is here where we'll be sheltered from the night. The idea of the sheltered from the long night. Through our ceilings, the worms and roots will watch over us. The idea is that the gods are watching over them. Through the floors, hell's fires will warm us. They will be between heaven and hell. There's this idea surviving. And I shall take my place on the Green Seer's throne to guide us through this long and difficult age, the age of darkness. He's talking about the long night, of course, and him being on the Green Seer's throne. Offerings will be made, and the gods will smile on them. His idea, he's mentioning here his sacrifices to the others. They will smile on us too, like mothers on their unborn children as they wonder what they dream of in the dark. Yeah, I thought this was a really beautiful, beautiful kind of line, because it's true that, like, if you've ever been around a pregnant woman, and when their unborn fetus starts kicking, that's from like REM sleep and stuff like that. They always wonder, like, oh, what are they dreaming about? Well, what do you dream about in the dark? I don't, what do you dream about when everything's been black? But this is the idea that the gods will be fawning over the stoneborn in the same way that mothers fawn over their children and wonder what they dream of in the dark. Because here they will be underground in the dark, like unborn children. And so let us dream and await the rosy dawning of our new name day, that eventually they'll come out of the earth and be born anew. The hall erupted in cheers. They pounded on all the tables, and someone blew a unicorn horn. Stoneborn, stoneborn, stoneborn. The chant subsided, and the Lord smiled softly. But not all of us are for the dreaming. There's a war in the twilight. I always like that line, war in the twilight. And we've made a pact with King Stannis. On the morrow, Lord Rickon will depart for the White Harbor. Some of our own will go in with him. Stoneborn will show the north the metal of Skagosi. They look down on us of savages, but we'll show our true worth. By gods, we will. This is just getting the idea that there's a Skagos north rivalry here. More cheers, and then a toast to King Stannis. Davos drank deep. After the guards helped their lord back to his seat, Davos turned to him. His Grace will be pleased with this alliance. I look forward to our next meeting, perhaps in King's Landing, once Stannis sits the Iron Throne. And here's the reveal. The Magnar tilted his head. I fear you haven't understood me, Lord Seaworth. Tomorrow's ships will be for Lord Stark and his other companions, but you will remain here. His heart dropped like an anchor, because of course he's a sailor. Dropped like an anchor. Here, my lord, I need to return to my king. And in time you will. We only need to ensure your seed has quickened. Once the girl has missed her moonblood, your duty will be concluded, and we'll send you to the king's side. Davos was confused. Our agreement was for the Lord's right to be fulfilled. I played my part. He felt his anger rising. My damned part. And here we get into this, the religion discussion. Do you think our most sacred ritual is only to sate mere foul desires? Of course, when we hear of the Lord's right to the first night, that's what we think, that it's only here to sate desires. But I suppose in other, this is this idea, this theory that the Lord's right of the first night is the thing producing the bastards, and the bastards are the things being sacrificed to the others. And that is the cycle. And we're kind of hinting at this, that the ritual leads to the children, which leads to the whole thing. Lord's right at the first night is part of the bargain with the others. And that when Alysanne stopped the practice, she caused some trouble. No, the gods command it for a higher purpose. Lord Skriel shook his head gently, polite and scorned. The mainlanders are forgotten their old ways. Things are different here. The Stoneborn remember and have held the right true since the dawn of days, when the first of us crawled naked from the earth. So this idea, this is when they crawled naked from the earth, is the idea is that during the long night, they were kept underground. And so when they came out, they have this ritual that they need to have the right. They need to pass their children they need to create these bastards to pass them to the others as part of the deal. The others need a mechanism for procreation, and so it all fits. He stopped to study Davos. But how can I expect you to see the truth of our skies, of our rivers, of our trees, when you pray to a god cloistered in a seven-sided box? This is just a direct criticism that their religion is based on nature and seeing the world around, and the idea is that this god in a sept would be cloistered and wouldn't be able to see the world. They'd be blind. It's also getting to this idea that the Andals and their ways are the things that have really crushed the the old god's way and have caused the problem. Queen Alisane and such, her being a follower of the seven. Mother of mercy. And then we get indignant Davos, because he follows the seven gods and he's been spoken to by the mother. I worship the seven gods, indignant, who made us all. This is the seven gods who made us all is something that I forget. It might be in Sam. It's something in the song. All the way from Andalos they did. This is just kind of this joke, like, it's very like, so generally speaking, when secularists, so when secular people talk about the evolution of religion, they usually talk of it being, it starts out as a worship of nature, and then the pieces of nature start getting identities, and the polytheism is kind of the first thing. And then over time, civilizations start worshiping one god, but they recognize that other people worship different gods. So it's polytheist in the sense that there are many gods, but they worship one god. And so when we talk about, like, when you look at the Bible, God says, don't worship other gods because I'm jealous. Well, I mean, that's kind of recognizing that other gods exist. And it's very true. It's very clear that in those early days of in the Middle East, like, that they had transitioned from worshiping many gods to one god, but recognizing that other gods exist that are worshipped by other people. And then things transition to an exclusionary sense that no, there's one true God and the other gods are all fake and that's it. Right? So this is kind of in that, like, they kind of recognize that, like, yeah, that there were these old gods, and there were these gods in Andalos that they worshiped, that the seven were gods of Andalos. And then they became the gods who made us all. And so this is getting into that conflict. The Magnar scoffed, but then grew serious. Lord Bolton is said to keep the old gods. Pity we're at war. Mayhaps he would better understand what I say better. And there's the big threat. You don't want to participate in the Lord's Word at the first night? Well, I guess our alliance is done, So Davos stiffened. Careful. We need the boy. Getting back to, give me the boy. We need the boy. The boy, in a sense, they're taking the boy from the Magnar. They're giving a boy to the Magnar. He took a breath to calm himself. I'll stay until she's without moonblood. Then the Magnar nodded thoughtfully and then forced a smile. It may be best if you tumble the bride tomorrow and the day after. All the sooner to get her with child. This idea that he went through this horrible experience once, and now he realizes that he has to go through the experience many, many times over. Because he needs to get her pregnant. Okay, let's take a break here, and I will conclude. We will finish up next time. As after this, we have Davos going off with Osha. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.